Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Annie Behrens, and on behalf of the Addison Early Childhood Collaborative and the Wheaton Warrenville Early Childhood Collaborative, we would like to welcome you to our event today. The first piece of housekeeping that I would like to share with everyone is that we encourage you to ask questions in the chat, and my co-host Mary and I will ask our speaker today some of the questions that we see come through the chat. So we just encourage that interaction, and when we get to the Q&A portion of today's event, we will hopefully get a bunch of your questions answered. So what I'd like to do next is introduce our speaker more fully to all of you. And her name is Dr. Iheoma Iruka. And Dr. Iruka is a research professor in the Department of Public Policy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is also a fellow at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute and the founding director of the Equity Research Action Coalition there. Dr. Iruka is engaged in projects and initiatives focused on how evidence-informed policies, systems, and practices in early education can support the optimal development and experiences of children from low-income and ethnic minority households. These policies, systems, and practices include family engagement, like our topic today, and support quality rating and improvement systems and early care and education systems and programs. Dr. Iruka has been engaged in addressing how best to ensure excellence for young, diverse learners, especially Black children, such as through development of a classroom observation measure, examination of non-traditional pedagogical approaches, public policies, and publications geared toward early education practitioners and policymakers. Today's event is entitled Culturally Responsive Anti-Bias Family Engagement and Support, an Essential Component for Child's Wellbeing and Learning. It is often stated that parents are their children's first teacher, but our research agenda, policy drivers, workforce supports, and program standards often neglect family engagement and support and educators and professionals who make this a priority. COVID-19 has reminded us of the primary and central role that families play and why early education should concretely and intentionally involve families in the learning, decision, and approaches. This keynote will talk about the critical importance and value of parenting and family engagement and support for young children's learning and overall well-being. Discussion will focus on our current evidence base about parenting and family engagement and gaps in the literature and lessons being learned through the coronavirus pandemic. More importantly, attendees will learn about the 4 E's of culturally responsive anti-bias family engagement and support that early childhood professionals should engage in to strengthen their active partnership with families in support of children's learning, development, and well-being. And with that, it is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Iheoma Iruka.
Thank you, Annie. It says that I can't share my video. It's probably under the button you have to click. So hopefully everybody can hear me while Annie's getting my video up. I think with the webinar, it's everybody who joined couldn't do video or anything. So I think you're gonna work on that. Thank you. But I wanna say good morning to all of you out there. And just so thankful for Mary and for Annie for inviting me. I know it'd be better if we were together in person, but we have to make the best of what we have, and hopefully being able to do this together virtually will still allow you to both engage as you see fit, but also be able to take care of loved ones, anything that you're doing as well. And as Annie said earlier, feel free to use the Q&A box, to chat her, anything, just to make sure that if there's some critical things that we can really bring that forward. And it's also the raise hand feature. I think we're doing it webinar as opposed to meeting, but there's a raise hand feature. So I think if you raise your hand, and I think Annie or Mary as the host should be able to acknowledge you and bring you forward to be part of the conversation. So again, thank you for allowing me to enter your space. And so as Annie said, I came back to UNC in October 2020. And it's been, and I was here actually as a postdoc, and I was here for about 6 years or so before I went to University of Nebraska and then high scope. And so I just came back to really launch the Equity Research Action Coalition, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. But I do want to go ahead and say thank you for the invitation again. But also, before I really get started, I want to take a moment to honor Native lands. I want to acknowledge that I live and work and build my family's economic wealth on the Lumbee tribe, which was taken through colonization and attempted eradication by settlers. And I also want to point out that the Lumbee tribe is still very much active in the western part, the eastern part of the state of North Carolina. They still provide a lot of services, support, advocacy, and continue to make sure that the cultural heritage, the roots, the connection to the land is still here with us. And for me, I think it's really important that we go through these acknowledgements, because it's a way to also create greater consciousness of both Native sovereignty, their cultural rights. And to me, this is part of equitable relationships, right? Which is the premise that we're talking about today. So how do we get to that sort of equitable rights if we don't really think about history and sort of some of the pain and trauma that we have caused to some communities? And actually, I could share my screen I forgot I could just share my screen too while my video is being worked on. I apologize for that. I'm so used to my face and all that good stuff. So while Annie's still working on freezing my actual video, you should be able to see my slides. So sorry for that. And so in addition to honoring Native lands, I think it's also important for me to honor Black bodies as a person that is African-American, Black, and from the African diaspora, because we do know that many parts of the US was built by enslaved Africans and their enslaved descendants. And really only within the past generation were Black people afforded full rights. And that's really my generation. So my parents' generation, they were not considered full human beings or citizens. They were considered really 3/5 of the law, right? So it really is, it's important for us to understand how much we've progressed, but also that the progress hasn't been that recent, right? Like it has really been recent, I should say. And we know that today, Black people and other people of color disproportionately work as service staff across the country. And this community is largely responsible for the maintenance of our daily lives, the food and food services available, early care education, I'm pretty sure you know that already, healthcare, and many other basic necessities that make our lives easy, right? And in some instances, I will argue that in many ways that you are subsidizing our ability to actually thank you, Annie, our ability to actually, live life, right? When you are all subsidizing sort of our care. So the wealth of our nation is due to the forced and free labor of these Africans. And I think it's important that we acknowledge both the land that we live, work, make, our wealth, but also who sort of free labor, right, really created many parts of this country, both Black people, but also we know Asian folks as well, and Latino folks as well, really were part of creating a lot of this country, but also maintain it as we see today. So I just want to give you a high level about the Equity Research Action Coalition, the reason I came back. I think it helps to center who I am. So as you listen to me, I hope it gives you a sense of like, what am I trying to really do, right? So the Equity Research Action Coalition is a collaborative at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at UNC Chapel Hill. And so if you've heard of Frank Porter Graham or FPG, for some people, FPG is best known for the Para-Preschool Study, which is one of the two seminal studies. Some people argue three because you include Chicago Parent Centers, but it's one of the seminal studies that has continued to show that when we invest in early care education interventions, that we get 8 to 10%, return from all the health social benefits from that. And so this is Frank Porter Graham. And the idea of the Equity Research Action Coalition is to really focus on co-constructed, actionable research and evaluation with practitioners, policymakers, those who are adjacent to this work, to support the optimal development of Black children, particularly prenatal through childhood. And I center my space with Black children because, I'm Black and it's, that's just who I am. But I also think it's just as important that for me, I think of Black people as when things are done on behalf of Black people, we know that it really fans out to also make it possible for whether it's Native communities, Latino communities, Asian communities, LGBTQIA. So for me, it's also understanding the value of focusing on Black people, because it's gotten us civil rights, it's gotten us education and many other systems. And so while I focus on Black children and families, I also recognize that there are many groups that are continuing to be marginalized in our system. And that includes many families who, whether they're immigrants, whether they have disabilities. So for me, is recognize that while I center on Black children and their intersectionality, I recognize the other groups that are also harmed. And we're really working at the intersection of research, practice, and policy. And that's something hard to do, right? When you're a researcher, you want to kind of just do research. But for me, it's really important that research is not done in this kind of echo chamber, this kind of vacuum, but that research is actually actionable to either make changes in practice and policy, but also by directionality, meaning that I want to know what's happening on the ground, right? So I hope that some of you all will unmute or put in your Q&A to tell me what you all are doing that really is centering families, particularly different groups of families. And so, because then maybe there's a whole thing we should be doing on the research side, right? Because research could be late. And so being able to know what is happening practice-wise, what is happening policy-wise. And so making sure that then we research that as opposed to the other way. And I would say that what I try to hold in my lens for a lot of times is anti-racism and cultural wealth. Anti-racism is really the idea that racism is part of the US system. And so because it's part of the US construction system, I always look through that sort of racial lens, but also recognizing that we have things like xenophobia. We have things around, children and families with disability. We have things around sexism and classism. So when I say anti-racism, I'm actually encompassing a lot of our other sort of structured inequities that we know is permeating, including in early care education. I mean, that's a whole different conversation where we know that there's a reason why early care education has not been fully afforded the full right in terms of funding, resources, value, and support. And so in terms of anti-racism, there's also the lens of cultural wealth. And that to me is actually a part that undergirds a lot of the family engagement work that I'm hoping to talk with you all today, which is the idea that we should recognize the systemic inequities that exist for families. We need to also recognize that there's a lot of wealth that families bring to the situation, right? It may not come in a package that you're used to. It may not come in a language that you're used to. It may not come in a fuzzy, bunny slippers that we may like, but we need to recognize there's a lot of wealth that families are bringing, especially if they're families of color, families of immigrant backgrounds, families living in poverty. We can recognize that no matter your social category or categories, there's a lot that each parent is bringing. And how do we activate that in our spaces, both for us as professionals, but also for the children, but also for the whole entire community that we're part of. So before I get started, I don't know if it's going to work with you all, the webinar land, since I don't know how close you are to your phone, your computer, or whatever, but I thought it'd be good. So if you happen to be close by, to do a word cloud. And really I want you to give me a one word or phrase to describe family engagement from your point of view, right? Something may put on relationships, or it could be hard work. And if you do hard work, put a hyphen or put it together in one word, because then it'll break it apart if you separate it. So either hyphenate it or put it together. So I'll just be curious. And so to do that, what you should be able to do is go to pollev.com /Iheoma Iruka. I know that's challenging to spell at 9 a.m. 9:15 Central Time. So Iheoma Iruka 437. So if you're close by your computer, feel free to complete it, and feel free to do it throughout the session. And I'll pop it open again later on in case there's something else that sort of grabs your mind. So also let us know if you are having any issues in terms of getting to the word cloud, but I'll keep it on for a couple of seconds, but I'll pull it back up again. But feel free to kind of think of one word or phrase to describe family engagement. And one of my words that I will say, I love partnership. One of the words I think about is, savior. I think about, and really, right, we see the word collaborative popping up, vital popping up, work popping up. And so the bigger the words, the more that you see people are saying it or something like that. And so you can see, thank you for all those who are engaged in the word cloud. See, it's changing little by little, right? This is data collection. I know for those who don't know, this is actually data collection, right? So these are the different words that are coming through. We have partnerships already, relationships, collaborative, outreach, vital, building. Continue to sort of mull on that. Like, I love it. See, look at that. Yeah, I see culturally What else am I missing here? Build in. So continue to fill it out. It will still be active, but I'm going to go ahead. But thank you for that. I know that's your morning wake up. So go get your coffee or tea or water, but that's your morning wake up call. But so here's my take home message for everyone. So keep going, and I'll come back to that slide so you can see all that people said. So I'm going to be preaching to a choir probably for the most part, but I hope to, as I preach to a choir, I hope to activate some other pieces, right? So I want to give you my take home message. So you at least know, you know, like it's almost like when you put the your direction, your address on Google Map, like this is the direction we're going to go, right? And so now we're going to take different pathways, but this is our destination, I should say, right? This take home message is my destination. One is that science is clear, that families matter for children's development and learning. I don't know how many times I have to say this to people, especially those who are really in the, who are focused on classrooms and QIS. And again, it's not that those are not important, but we know from our evidence that while classroom is important, we know that families are even more important. And I don't know why I have to say that, but that's literally what I have to say all the time. The science is clear that a lot of who children are, what we see with them is really in because of the family ecosystem. And when I say family, I don't just think about mother, father, mother, father. Like, I don't just think about those biological, but I also think about non-biological. I think about extended kinship, especially when you look at different groups of people. They're not necessarily all going to be blood related. Not every person has a blood relative. And some people are being raised outside of sort of their biological home. Some people are being raised by community members, by foster care, child welfare, et cetera, right? So we need to be really expansive in our thinking about families. And I want to also make note that if we know the history of our country, if we recall that many children, particularly the Native population, Native children being taken away from their homes back in the day to make them more acculturated to America, right? And we know the history of enslaved Black people, enslaved people who literally you were taking families and separating them and selling them and killing one off, and because they were property. And so we need to, so for some communities, the idea of family is much more expensive. And so as we think about families, we have to really, I think, shift our mind a little bit from what is a family? Is it just a mother and father? Is it that gendered? Or is it really, how diverse can it be? And what does it look like in your community? What does it look like in your programs? How do we respond to sort of the dynamic nature of families, especially for those who have had losses due to COVID, right? The idea of family is shifting and changing for many reasons. And COVID-19 in many ways has also shifted that as well. We do know that homeschool connections do reduce inequitable learning opportunities and experiences. We can talk about why is that, why do I need to be connected to you in order to make sure that my child or children have opportunities in learning? But we know that that does matter. And I particularly think that authentic partnership with families should be viewed as a social justice strategy, right? If you're talking about equity writ large, part of it that you have to do is think about, how do I engage with families in a way that's honoring, in a way that's not harmful, in a way that's really about, how do I support you and your child? How do I see the greatness of what you do as a parent for your child? How do I see the greatness of your contribution to this space that we call schools or programs? So to me, it's really thinking about families in a much deeper way than just this person who happens to be the parent of, Jawan, or the parent of Jameer, right? So we need to be much more introspective about, who is this person, right? Because they're a parent probably, but it's also more to them that we have to uncover and discover. And to me, partnering with families is one strategy to educate, to ensure children are healthy and they're thriving. In the end of it, right, the idea of raising children, right, children are in your programs, right, but the idea is that we should be working together, right? I'm a mother of 2 young children. And for me, I can't be everywhere, clearly, because neither can you all, because you're also working, right? If you're fortunate to be working and be able to enjoy what you do. But there's a level of partnering that has to happen. It is not every single day, every moment. It's not always perfect, but it's a level of where you have to understand, what are my goals for my kids, and how is your program, your school, your approach going to meet that? How are we doing that? And what is the dance that we have to do? And so my suggestion is what I call the 4 E's of exploration, expectation, education, equipment. To me, that's part of foundational for partnerships. And I'll tell you why I think the 4 E's really, because number one, it's easy to remember 4 E's. But I think it's also just, to me, you want to have tools that can help to guide you as you think about, what should I do with family A? Right? What are some things that you can do to really begin to activate your engagement, relationship, partnership with families, and especially families who you may feel like you don't have a lot in common with, right? Families that you're like, well, they seem kind of cold to me, or they seem like they don't like me, but really what else could you be doing, or, to really create that trustful, close bond as much as you can, obviously, with families who really are really the guiding light for the children in your classroom. And I don't need to say this, but I need to say it because I want to make sure that there's no assumptions here, right? Because what they say about assumptions, it makes that of you and me. So I'm not gonna make any assumptions. So I'm gonna just share some things. But again, I want you all to feel free to use the chat box. Feel free to looks like I think there's a chat box, so you can be able to use that as well. So feel free to really engage with each other, engage with me, and obviously Annie and Mary are there, so they can also look at the chat box and also communicate. But I like this definition of family engagement, because a lot of times people think, oh, family engagement is about families going to school, doing volunteering. It's always one way, but it's really bi-directional. And so here's a definition I got from the Department of Health and Human Services. And this is that family engagement is about building authentic relationships with families that support family well-being, strong relations between parents and their children, and ongoing learning and development for parents, children, educators, and systems. And that is fact. Like, to me, first and foremost, it's almost like, yes, you can tell me about how to make sure that my kid is reading or doing all this academic work, which is great. Yes, please do that. But I think it's really important that we focus on how is the family doing, right? Because in the end of it, if the family is doing well, it is likely that the children are doing well. This is what our evidence already tells us. When families are strong, are stable, really have what they need, whether economically, socially, psychologically, when families have what they need to thrive, it is a higher likelihood that their child will thrive. So really, instead of trying to kind of speed bump past families, as many of our programs do, many of our interventions do, we try to speed bump through the family and say, well, good luck, just sign a consent form. We're really going to go fix your kids. It's really important that we begin to figure out how do we make sure that at the end of the day, that we understand that children are part of a larger system, AKA their families. And our job is to make sure that that system is as strong as possible. So also make sure that that relationship between parents and children are also strong, right? Because we know in many ways that, parents are dealing with their own issues, and children are children, right? They have their own temperament. They're going to have their own thoughts, and being able to make sure that parents and children are in sync can be really valuable. And then, of course, to me, building relationship is ongoing, right? We learn from those who are around us. We learn how to better communicate with others, maybe not with that parent or families, but maybe downstream. And so to me, it's about the ongoing learning development for parents, for children, for educators, and for the system. And the more that we're intentional about engaging with families in ways that is meaningful, especially for families who are often not considered. And I'll give you some data in a few. The more we really go deeper, as opposed to how are you doing, parent? Oh, everything is good. But if we can go deeper with families about what more could we do? Again, not knowing that you already do a lot of work. So let me recognize that first and foremost. But we do know that to make our jobs easier in the classroom, it is important to know what is happening with families, what are their insights, what are their interests, that actually makes our job in the classroom easier. So it's about the bidirectionality of family engagement and support, and that we should not ignore that. And I want to just, as I kind of share a couple of sort of data points, because I am a researcher after all, that families are managing a lot. You are managing a lot, whether you're a parent or a child, a community parent, an educator, you are a parent, right? In some form or another, and you are managing a lot, and families are managing a lot, especially if they happen to catch COVID or have a loss and all the things that are happening. And so there's a lot. And I think it is important that we both give families grace and really, I think, take a much more of an asset framing, but also give yourself some grace. You're like, you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to, have the right attitude with the families, but it's something that we need to kind of make sure that we continue to work on, is give yourself grace, give families grace, and knowing that we are managing a lot. But with that in mind, I want to sort of share with you a few data points around issues that we rarely talk about. At least we were. I mean, there's some growing movement here, but there's some things we've never talked about. So I'm going to share with you a few things from our Black parent voices, because they'll set up the 4 E's and why we should go deeper in terms of anti-bias family engagement. So the Black parent voices is just like think of it as kind of like one of the cheese. There's a lot of different voices you can hear. You can hear from our Native community, our Asian and Pacific Islanders, or families who are in the LGBTQ spectrum, or families of parents with disabilities and dealing with other kinds of adversities, families living in poverty. So there's a lot of different voices and lenses, but I'm going to use this one just to to really center what I consider the dual pandemics, the two pandemics of COVID-19 and racism, right? Because it's something that we often don't think a lot about. I think some of us probably do, but I'll be curious, and if you have comments, feel free to share in the chat. How much have you talked about racism with your families? Like anything about whether it's racism, about racial identity, cultural identity, anything, right? So I'll be curious for you all to just, if you are comfortable to share, to what extent have you talked with families about anything, right? You may have talked about like how you're doing with COVID, but have you talked about how you're doing with, issues of racism or bias or discrimination? Have you talked about any of that with your families? So I'm going to just give just a minute or so, just in case you have thoughts. Feel free to please put it in the chat box. I'm pretty sure you have the ability to put it in the chat box. So yeah, I'm going to, yes, okay. So we'll just take a moment. Yeah, share whatever you want to, and we can talk about it. And if you don't have anything to share right now, it's totally okay. But I'm hoping that as we sort of proceed, because this is like a 2-hour session, give or take. I'm not going to do all the talking, of course, but I want you to kind of think about like, if you're like, I haven't, then that's just, you haven't. Or I never thought I was appropriate, or I just think the kids are too young, or whatever, right? So it'll be great to understand if you have. And if so, what have you done? If you have not, is there a reason, or you just never thought about it? So I'd just love to hear that. So feel free to put your thoughts in the comment box, and then we can look through that I do see somebody was bold enough. So thank you, Anna, for adding your thoughts. So Anna says, we always ask families during intake about their family, language, and where they're from when they arrived in the US, since we work with a lot of refugees, and how they're adapted, and then follow up. Thank you, Anna. I think that's really important. So I think that makes sense, right? I feel like that's almost really makes sense, right? When you're dealing with refugees. I remember in Nebraska, that's another place where refugees are often settled, is kind of in the Midwest, and Nebraska is one of the states. And I did remember a lot of the programs that I connected with actually often doing that, asking how could they make their adaptation, right? Because it's really, when you're a refugee versus immigrant, it's a very different experience, right? Because you're escaping something that's traumatic or likely traumatic. And so and the government sets it up differently. And so being able to have the opportunity to just ask those in-depth questions is really important as well. And so I'll be curious what others as well are doing in terms of asking families deeply about, what are their needs and what do they need help with, and how could you facilitate any of their supports. So feel free to continue to use the chat box. And so what I'm going to now do is share you a couple of data points. And because here's the reason why we need to go deeper when it concerns anti-bias family engagement. I'm really trying to really support the well-being of children. So I'm going to show you a couple of data points from the Rapid EC study, which is basically the rapid assessment of the pandemic. And so this, in the early stages of the pandemic, a team at Oregon who's now moved to Stanford were engaging in trying to understand how families with young children are dealing with the pandemic, whether economically, health-wise, et cetera. And so with my network, the Rising Network, we really brought questions around racism and discrimination. And so because we recognize that while there is a pandemic, we also recognize that many families of color in particular were dealing still with racism and discrimination, right? Because don't forget that summer of 2020 was a lot that was happening around racial reckoning. And so we thought it was really important that we don't ignore kind of that big elephant in the room, because we tend to do that. And so I'm going to just share with you a couple of your survey items, just to give you a sense of if you've ever seen this data and what would you do with the data if you actually ask this question. And so I'll just flag for this particular report, the data is from April to November of 2020, and it's focused on Black families, but there is data around Latino families, Asian families, but also white families. And for here, the average household income was $69,000, which is actually almost $15,000 more than the median income for Black households. So this was a higher income families. 8% of them were immigrants, which is actually consistent with the census. About 10% of Black people are actually immigrants. Majority speak English and represent 43 states in the District of Columbia. And so we asked a question on the survey, and I should say this survey happens every other week. And so we're able to add in a lot of questions to ask families, and they get $5, and it's pretty much like a 15-minute sort of like Qualtrics survey. And so anyway, so we asked parents about their experience of racism and discrimination. And we asked them prior to and since the pandemic. So for example, have you been unfairly stopped, searched, questioned, physically threatened, or abused by the police because of your race or ethnicity? For fair reasons, have you not been hired for a job because of your race or ethnicity? And then we also ask them not just about themselves, now about their concerns for their children prior to or since the pandemic. So some of the questions are: get a stop in a white neighborhood, being punished more harshly than others. And so I'll just show you the data points. So this data, just to walk you through, is basically the experience of Black families. And this lighter sort of reddish salmon color is pre-pandemic levels, what parents reported. And the darker color is during the pandemic, again, between August and November of 2020. So really the height of the pandemic. And then the dashed line is really all other parents, right? So this includes your white parents, your Latina parents, your Asian parents, so all the above. But what you can see in the pattern is that pre-pandemic parents, a lot of parents report, at least 20% reported getting worse service, denied service, police mistreatment, being called a slur. So you can see, in terms of the variation before the pandemic. But then after the pandemic, you see it really drop precipitously on all the questions about parents' experiences of discrimination, right? And of course, we know because a lot of people were literally at home, or at least wear masks, or there wasn't a lot of engagement between them and other people. So whether it was like denied services, there wasn't that much services because a lot of things were closed or really reduced. And so it makes sense. But you can still see, even after we sort of take into account during the pandemic, we still see that across the board, Black families are more likely to report still experiencing discrimination from denying credit, redlining, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see the compounded nature of what parents are experiencing. So if you're working with families, right, we need to understand what are their experiences. Yes, they may be, say, below, poverty, but are there other additional layers of stress that they're dealing with, right? When you're called a slur, it may feel like, well, that's just a slur, but it can really have, psychological consequences, or being denied credit, or being treated unfairly by the police. We have data to now indicate that when you experience these things, it actually has impact on your healthy development and even your child's healthy development. So if we're asking only about issues of economic challenges or stressors, if we don't ask about these psychosocial stressors, this is really a concern, right? Because that means that we're ignoring a facet of people's lived lives, and we know the manifestation of psychosocial stressors on both families' well-being and children's well-being. So if you're trying to really support children's well-being, it's important that we understand the kinds of things that families are dealing with. You may not be able to go give them credit, right? Or stop the redlining, but there are things that you can potentially begin to really call out, especially if you're a program or you're part of the community, to call out about what different people are experiencing that could really be harmful, not just for them, but also for their child. So now we ask parents about their concerns for their children, right? So so a lot of times, like I think to Anna's good point about asking parents about doing a needs assessment. What are your concerns? What are your fears? And so I wonder if you ever ask questions about either parents' experience with discrimination and their concerns for their children because of their race, ethnicity, right? And you may ask, like, why would I ask this question? Like, why would this matter? Because if we understand the racialized context that we live in, right? If we understand that the U.S. was literally built in a way that structured opportunities, if we understand the history, if we understand the data, we know that based on your race, on your place, your gender, your class, that there's certain opportunities that are either provided for or not provided for you. And so for us, it's important that we recognize that your race could also be a marker of opportunity or lack of opportunity. And so for parents here, again, similar to what I showed you before, the lighter sort of salmon color is your pre-pandemic levels. And then your darker color is your during the pandemic levels, again, at the height of the pandemic from August to November for this data anyways. And you can see across the board that Black parents, above and beyond other parents, are likely to report having concerns about their child being excluded, unfairly treated, being discouraged, harsh punishments, being in a white neighborhood, but all the parents all mention we have challenges about care and education, which is that bright light in some of this, that sadly, all the parents basically agree that we have concern about early care education opportunities, regardless of race, ethnicity. So that's something to say, yay, but it's also one of the highest ones that they all have concerns about. Again, that makes sense. When during this time, a lot of programs were shut out, they were unaffordable, they were unavailable because of the limited nature, and parents had to go to work, right? So again, but it's important to ask these questions to what extent do parents have concerns that their child won't have opportunities as other kids, merely because of their phenotype, merely because of the way they sound, their language? So these are things to sort of think about in your needs assessment. Do we ask these questions? Because they add another layer that we often don't think about, right? And so it's something that we need to sort of really pay attention to. And then I'm going to sort of, read a couple of these things just to give you a sense of in parents' own words, right? So in their own words, here's some things that they said, the Black parents in particular. So one Black parent said, the additional trauma of watching Black people being killed and no justice being served is devastating. It is compounding trauma. Then the weight of having white folks want me to spend emotional labor to help them feel better about a racist system I did not make. I am exhausted, and what energy I have left, I want to spend on loving my family and keeping them safe from COVID-19 and racists. Another parent says the following: racism. The historical and contemporary trauma and grief that is occurring is overwhelming. Add that on top of a pandemic when I cannot use my regular outlets to center myself, gym, hang out with friends, etc. It is exhausting. And so the reason I share these words with you is that it helps to kind of really ground that, yes, we're all dealing with a level of COVID-19 somewhere or the other, but there are groups of people who are dealing with other kinds of level of trauma, of stressors that are so pernicious that it's literally the air that they breathe. And so how do we make sure that we recognize that, right? What does that mean for the kind of questions we ask? What does that mean for the kind of programming we may have? What does that mean for the community organizations that we decided to connect with? What does that mean for the children in the classroom, right? If their families are dealing with this sort of invisible stressor, right? That's literally in every single thing, from the store to the bank, to the school, to the job, it's everywhere. And so what does this mean for parents? What does this mean for children's own well-being, right? And this is the part of where, for me, anti-bias is really about how to make sure that we recognize that we're never all going to deal with the same thing. That's almost impossible. But are there things that we continue to sort of ignore, either because it's uncomfortable, because we don't think it's important? I don't know, right? So that's for us, I think, really explore. Why don't we talk about this when we know families actually talk and think about these issues, right?
Dr. Iruka?
Yes.
May I jump in for just a moment, please?
Of course.
I don't know if timing right now is good related to the rest of the story you want to tell with your data, so you gauge that. But when you have a moment, take a look at Susan's comment, if you could, please. I think it's very important, and I think it relates precisely to the last couple of slides that you just talked through. And again, timing is your call, but if you want to address that now or in a few minutes, that would be great.
Oh, thank you for flagging that. Yeah, because I can't always look at my chat box, my slides. So thank you, Mary. And Susan, thank you so much for your question about, obviously, for those, if you're close to your screen, you can read it, but I'll read it in case some people are appearing by phone, that says, I'm not a provider, but work with them. And I would say these conversations generally aren't happening, particularly in environments that are predominantly white with a handful of families of color. Providers feel uncomfortable and are at a loss, as to where to begin. And so thank you, Susan, for that. That is often a question I get, especially when I talk about these sort of issues. And so I would definitely be flagging that. But I'm glad that you raised that up, right? Because, and that's what I was trying to figure out is it that people don't know this is happening? Or is it really because you're uncomfortable, because you don't want to sort of you don't want to, especially if you're a white provider, whether as a teacher or as a specialist or a supervisor, whatever your level is, right? You in the many ways, it's uncomfortable to ask these questions, because then if you look white or you are white, there's a level of like guilt and shame, like, well, it wasn't me, I didn't own slaves, and it's not my, so there's a level of that happens. And I will give some tools that I think that could help to really, I think, get through the uncomfortability. But what I would say is, first and foremost, is for us to recognize that racism is literally a system, right? It's not literally like, why some of the questions you ask about sort of individual experiences with like, do you deny credit or being called a slow? Like, yeah, yeah. But a lot of what the challenge is that it's a system that has been constructed, just like early childhood was not a system. Early childhood is not really a system, but let's go with that. In some places, it's an early child system. But in terms of a system, it means that there's a lot of different drivers at work. It's like there's a lot of policies, a lot of practices, a lot of cultures set up. And so in our US world construction is a system that has literally created hierarchy based on phenotype, based on your skin color, based on your economics, based on where you live or don't live. So in many ways, it's so systematic that you as an individual, you can't stop it. Like literally, I can't stop it, you can't stop it. But there are things that we can do to sort of make it visible, and also make sure that parents don't feel like it's my fault that I'm in this situation, right? That we are poor because I made a bad decision, right? Yeah, in some cases, sure. But we have to recognize that certain people's situation was actually systematic. It was literally intergenerational. And so in many ways, the same thing with sort of the racist system, a lot of it is that it's going to be there no matter what. And it's really privileging those who are higher income and white. And so in many ways, I think we just have to begin to unpack what is the system, how is it privileging some, and how is it not privileging others. And the more you kind of look at it, not from a colorblind, but look at it from like, you know what? I know that I am privileged if I look white or if I'm white in this system. I know that me just being white is better than me being Black or brown. But it's also recognizing that the system is operating the way it was intended. And your job, our job, is to disrupt it, right? And that's to sort of make it visible, to say to a parent, you know what? I'm sorry you experienced this. Let's talk about, what are your fears, right? What could I do as a provider, as a whatever your role is? And so I think the more we kind of don't make the assumption that being racist is an individual act, it is systematic. And the more we, I think, understand that, the more we sort of remove our fragility, we remove our uncomfortability. I mean, it's always gonna be uncomfortable, let me be honest, but it removes a little bit of that from the self, right? It's no longer about you. It's literally about, it's a system that was constructed. And when I die, when you die, it's still gonna be here, unfortunately, right? And so I think when you remove your person out of it, you get to literally see how it operates. And the more you see how it operates, the more you can say, how do I use my privilege as whether it's a middle income, higher income, a white person, an educated person, whatever your privilege is, how do I use my privilege to disrupt it and to provide opportunities for others? So, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think that was a really good question, right? But it's about, in essence, work through your discomfort, like work through that and realize that it's not really about you in the end. It's about a system that's created. And just say, let me see what Anna says in case. I feel we hear it more than ever, race equity, but I'm wondering if we're going to ask these questions, what are some talking points and how is that going to help the families? So that's a really good question, Anna, in terms of like, we're hearing it more. We are hearing it more, but we're also hearing the backlash to it, right? So we're also hearing, issues of race and racism, but we're also hearing this backlash, which I would say is connected to Susan's question. People are uncomfortable with the truth, right? I mean, I can't change my skin color, just like I can't change the history, but how do we make sure that we move through the discomfort? And so when you're saying what are some talking points and to help families, I think is in the end of it is acknowledging it, right? The problem that we have often had is that we never actually talk about it, right? We make the assumption of, oh, it was back then in the 1619, the 1800s, is no longer here. We had a Black president, we got a Latino, somebody or another. Like we sort of make all these like we're better, right? And I think we have to sort of move beyond the visible stuff and really begin to just make it visible. Because for me as a Black mother, it's visible. Like I literally, when I was pregnant, I literally thought about, am I gonna die? Is my baby gonna die? Because I looked at the data, right? I know these data points, right? And that's a level that some people don't have to think about. And so I think in many ways, by you just, asking the questions, some of the questions, right? It allows the conversation to start, right? But by not even asking it, it's in some ways you're kind of being colorblind. And when you're colorblind, you don't see the beauty, you don't see the joy, but you also don't see the pain. And to me, to develop authentic relationships, you have to be ready to see the potential pain that families go through. They may not shed a tear, but you know that there's a lot of stresses they're dealing with, but that they're still managing. And so to me, it's about just asking a question, like, how are you doing? Right? We if you're in Illinois, of course, you see, it's not like we don't hear about cop killings in Illinois and everywhere else. And it happens to be predominantly Black people, Black men. And I can say, here's one story. There's a school in Chicago, an early child program, a high quality. And I won't say the name, but they're one of the high quality programs that, governors tour, presidents have toured it. And I remember the teachers talking about how one of the kids got shot. And the two kids were related, they were cousins. And the teachers were, and this was maybe a few months later when we were having this large meeting in person, it was like back in 2019. And the teachers, in retelling the story, talked about how devastating it was for them, for their school community, to have to witness another brutal killing. And the fact that this little kid was sort of a bystander in this whole situation. And then a cousin who was also a young kid clearly had a secondary trauma. And the fact is that they recognize that part of the issue is about being Black, and they were Black teachers, but nobody ever asked them, how do you feel, right? Then the next day they had to get, I think the quality assessors will come in to come do assessments on them. And they were like, so wait a minute, I just went through all this trauma and now I have to act like nothing is wrong here. I'm going to just be normal, even though we're in the midst of dealing with some of the trauma that we experience as both Black educators. We know that our community, our schools, our children are dealing with it, and we're going to have to act like nothing is going on here. And so I think in many ways, the more we can at least acknowledge what's happening in the community and how it affects families and children and educators, the more we can now really say, you know what, let's have the conversation and then let's figure out what are some solutions. What are some mitigating things that we can do? But by not talking about it, it's not like it goes away. Like it doesn't go away in my household. It doesn't go away. It's just is that we know that it's secondary trauma that's just as impactful. Like I think about that could be my son. That could be my daughter. And so just like when people were doing the immigration raids, right? You talk to the Latino community in Chicago and Illinois, subproper, you'll hear them talk about the fear that they had. Even though it wasn't their kid being taken away, it was still traumatic to know that somebody who looks like your kid, who looks like your husband, your brother, your wife, your sister, is potentially losing a child just because they were trying to come to the States, right? So I think in the end of it, if we don't talk about these things, it's still affecting families. And if it's affecting families, it's affecting children, right? So I think it's just opening up the doorway. And if families don't want to talk about it, then you don't talk about it. But not talking about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? It just means that we'll just continue moving forward and we'll just not talk about it. And that's just not, I don't think, and that's not what we as early child people should be doing, right? Because we understand the importance of holistic development. We understand the importance of language, of literacy, of social emotional health. If we understand the importance of social emotional health, then we also need to understand that part of that requires a level of communication, of engagement, of relationship building. And so I would say that in many ways, families are likely ready to talk about it. They just want to make sure that you're not just going to ask and not do anything about it, or you're just sort of like, it's like almost like you're going on a tour. Like they want to know that you really care and that you really understand where they're coming from and what that may mean for the kind of community you create in the schools.
Dr. Iruka, I am just going to jump in with one follow-up to that because I get that point, and I think this also speaks to the end of Anna's comment, is would your recommendation be that as we're trying to get to a solution, it's about what can an educator do that day or in the coming days or in the coming weeks with that child on a social emotional level or something like that. I feel like we're moving from a system level concept to, okay, now as an individual, if I can have these conversations with a parent, I'm going to be compelled to want to help as an individual. And to me, the practical, realistic way that I could help is with guidance from a parent about how I can interact with the child during his or her daytime. Is that what you'd suggest?
Oh, that's such a great, so that's such a great question. And so I'm going to answer it, and I'm going to answer it this way. I'm going to say that while I say that racism is a system, we know that it has different levels. So it could impact who you hire, right? How come you have mostly white teachers and or teachers who speak English when you have different groups of kids around, right? So it could impact your hiring. It could also impact how you see groups of kids. So if you basically look at a Latino child and you're like, oh, you don't speak English, that's an assumption. That's literally an assumption, because and it's not unfair, but that's because that's how we've been primed to assume that every person who looks Latino or who looks like they're from Latin America or whatever, that they don't speak English. That's something that has been constructed in all of our sort of social media, everything else around the world. Like that's part of it. And so that means that then we may treat that kid in a particular way, not good or bad. We just may treat that kid in a particular way with that assumption. Never saying, okay, let me actually understand, do you actually speak Spanish, or do you actually speak English, or what, or a combination, or some other thing, right? So similarly with Black kids, that, you know, even though there's racist structure, we know that a lot of those racist structures have led to the narrative that, you know, Black kids are basically wild animals that must be controlled, they must be thrown out, all these other things. So it creates racialized experiences in the classroom, and also how we engage with families. And I can show you some data on that. And so that means that in many ways, before we do anything with the children, is really to look at ourselves, right? To say, okay, how did I get here? Like, what is my identity, right? And many times white people don't even think about their own identity. Like, they don't understand, they don't think about, what does my identity mean in terms of my privilege, or even my experiences? Did that help me or not? Or how do I walk through the world based on my identity, racially, my gender, my language, whether I'm, you know, part of the LGBTQ or not, whether I'm food secure, house secure. So there's a lot of different identities that we walk through. And so to me, it's important that we at least recognize that, and then recognize that we may have biases based on those who may not be like us, right? If you don't speak English in a particular way, if you don't like sort of live in a particular neighborhood, we have assumptions. And those assumptions sometimes drive our interactions or how we see kids and or families. So for me, it's really about first, make sure to at least know who you are. And then when you begin to have conversation with families, it's really about more inquisitive and not like judgment, right? Because even when we try, some of us, it's still judgment, comes that judgment. And so how do we make sure that we at least we're asking questions? And so when I talk about the 4 E's, I'll help you sort of think through, okay, how do I learn more about you, right? How do I learn more about your dreams, your fears, right? And that's what, when you see some of the questions about fears, it's almost like, do you have any concerns about sort of your child's race impacting how we see them, or your child's language, or your child's temperament, or even your child's size, right? So for me, it's almost like, how do we just take a step back and just explore and ask questions? To Anna's earlier question, how do we just find out about what makes you tick? Like, why did you pick us? You know, like, so I think the more we just identify families, the more we actually know children, right? Because at the end of it, the kids live in the house. Yes, kids have their own kind of thing, but the kids live in the family unit, whatever that looks like. And so the more we can explore from a lens of trying to understand, then I think then there's steps that we can do to now really say, let's not focus on fixing kids. Let's focus on making sure that we provide the best opportunities for children to feel like they're seen and they're heard, and also for families to feel like they're seen and they're heard, right? The more there's connection between homes and schools, then the more seamless it is for children, then their cortisol level won't be raised, right? If we tested kids' cortisol level in some places, it will be so high that they're working at a high level. And we know that when kids are on that high level of cortisol, that it eventually has downstream effect in terms of their health, because that's the stuff that raises your diabetes, heart diseases. That's why you have racial disparities in a lot of health outcomes, because you can't see the stress, you can't see the trauma, but fortunately your blood and your organs see it. And so that's why you do have, so that's one of the reasons people are saying we have these health disparities, because they start pretty early, right? The stresses are so early, but we never talk about it, and we never engage families in really talking about it as well. So I would say, think about your identity, and then really think about, how do I begin to ask families and engage in those conversations? And then think about your classroom. And I can give you some thoughts about what can you do in your classroom to just make it a little bit more open, affirming, caring, and just to enrich children's experiences, especially children who may not see themselves, right? Our Latino population, our, Native children, our Black children, children with disabilities. How do we just make sure that we are attentive to those who often are not the majority's sort of focus? Okay. And I see Maggie's question. Oh, thank you. Don't look away is yes. Thank you for flagging. I know my book. Yay. That was the 2020 book. I know I have a new one I'm going to be writing this summer. So thank you for really supporting that. It's definitely a journey of love and learning for me personally as well. And I can't read the whole thing, but thank you so much, Maggie, for flagging that. I want to see if there's a question in there. So for those who are not there, Maggie wrote, Annie and I have collaborated with teachers for PLC meetings and are reading Don't Look Away, which is the book that I wrote. This conversation really touches home with me in certain ways and relates to the conversations that my teachers and I have around chapter 2. how it made them uncomfortable to read and think about, as well as talk about. It was a really deep conversation and really opened up some doors and conversations for my teachers to think about in regards to themselves and their kiddos and families in their classroom. And that chapter is really trying to raise teachers' awareness of self. Like, who are your doctors? What neighborhood do you sort of spend your time in? Like your person situates how you may see kids or not, right? So it's really trying to kind of bring the teacher warrior forward by having people really think about their own sense of self, because you can't do work of anti-bias without thinking about, okay, who am I and how am I situated? Because then when I talk to families who are not like me, who don't sound like me, who didn't live like me, then judgments are likely to happen. I mean, I make judgments all the time. So I got to almost watch myself like, oh, I said that. Oh, I thought that. So we need to just make that more present, because the more you're aware of your biases, the more that you can actually sort of shift them away. But if you're not aware of it, you'll continue to sort of put people in boxes that is really unfair to them and also unfair to you. So thank you for raising that, Maggie. And really the learning is in the discomfort. Like, to be honest, being uncomfortable. And that's why for me, being uncomfortable is important. I moved to Nebraska because I was like, I need to grow, because I was in the East Coast. So sometimes being uncomfortable could really help us, I think, grow in many ways. But I know it's hard and it's not an easy process. So thank you. Keep the comments coming. I really just appreciated just the queries and the questions that came through. So Mary Annie, please feel free to flag me for anything else. I want to make sure that I also get to the couple of, like, here are the nuggets too, because we have about, I think, 40. We think about Q&A in like 45 minutes, like after 45 minutes. What do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking, yeah, I think we could start the Q&A. Yeah, in whenever works for you.
Okay, thank you. So and I'm happy to share your slides too, so don't feel like you have to take notes. But in the rest of the slides, I'm going to actually just skip a little bit. What I was just trying to say is that at the end of it, many families are stressed, especially Black families, who people tend to think, oh, they're doing fine, they're superwoman. You don't want them to feel like they're superwoman, because that actually creates weathering. And weathering meaning that that internally you may come out externally that you're doing fine, but internally your body is literally going through a lot of stress. And that stress actually kills off a lot of your cells and your organs, and that makes you predisposed to dying early. Now we actually know, a report was just released by National Urban League that Black people lost 5 years of life compared to white people. So it's killing you. So when I tell people I'm going to die, probably earlier than most, because it's just the stressors of it all. So it's important that we recognize the level of stress for many families of color and those who are dealing with extraordinary stressors, whether you're homeless or food insecure, especially if that happens over generation, because that has impacts on children. And so I just want to show you this graph of children during the pandemic, where we ask them to, ask parents to what extent are children being fussy. And you can see where it's relatively low. The darker red line is fussy or defiant, more of your externalizing behavior. And then your lighter is the too fearful or anxious, more of your internalizing markers. And you can see it's low, but you can see how it peaks, like it goes higher, right? That means that over time, as families are stressed, they don't have any outlets, they at least begin to see their children as having more behavioral challenges. And so it's just something that we have to understand, that there's a linkage, right? There's a connection between families and children, which is why we say we want families to have a strong relationship with their child, because we understand the connection. But that also means in the opposite, if families are highly stressed, it could impact their connection, their responsivity to their children, to their child and children, right? And that makes sense. And so it's important that when we're thinking about how do we support children's well-being, we kind of have to support the family's well-being, right? We can do things in a classroom to obviously mitigate that a little bit, but in the end of it, you can't solve child level problems with just a school-based problem, right? It has to be solved really from a holistic family community level, in ways that really permeates their daily lives in many ways, right? And so I just want to flag a couple of things, because I always have to kind of convince people that, parents does matter, right? Like I do a lot of early care education, the systems, the programs, but I feel like I have to convince people that parenting does matter. We may not know how to measure as well as we want. We may not know how to intervene. We may not know how to do it right, but we do know that it really matters. And so this National Academy's report, which came out in 2016, really, we looked at all the data available, right, in different spaces from home visited to early childhood, K-3. And really, we are like parenting matters. And the reason we have to make that as the title is because we're convincing people that parenting matters, which is kind of unfortunate to have to do that. But what we actually found is that parents' knowledge and attitudes matter for child development. So basically knowing, whether your child needs to be vaccinated or how to put in a car seat, that those knowledge actually matters for children's healthy development, right? Even parents' attitudes about whether or not they should be involved in schools or in their child's learning is something that matters, right? So if you come in certain communities or cultures or even countries, families are like, here's my baby, you do what you need to do, I'll do what I need to do. And so there's this kind of very role where teachers are seen as the brilliant one, and then parents are just doing whatever they say. So many ways we have to look at the kind of attitudes about roles of parents in raising children, and are there specific practices that we should think about. And so we need to understand that there's parent knowledge, and how do we develop parents' knowledge about child development? Again, I want us to be clear that I'm not even indicating or suggesting that families are stupid. Like, I think it's important that families know what their kids need, right? They're there. But there's some things that you literally don't know. Even for me as a parent who did developmental psychology about child development, I still need to go and look and ask my pediatrician, so this thing that's going on my child, should I be concerned? Like, there are things that we need to always learn, like, the vaccines that, that kids all have to get from the moment they're born, right? So there are things that the parents need to be aware of, the developmental milestones that are happening, right? When should I be concerned about wanting to get early intervention, or at least get my child assessed for early intervention, for example? So we need to continue to build parents' knowledge, both about children, but also about the system of support that may be available, from early intervention to family support to health systems. So we need to make sure that parents are aware of both practices, but also systems and agencies or organizations and communities that can be helpful for them as a parent, for their child, for their family writ large, or their community. So we need to make sure that parents have enough information to make the best decision. And then the attitudes, that's a hard one. To me, attitudes, you can't change your attitude or belief system. That's a hard one to shift. But in the end of it, I don't think that's our job. I think attitudes are, because it's based on how you grew up, it's based on your lived experiences, right? So there's some attitudes that, for those who may feel like, I don't need to do anything with my child, they go to school, it's the teacher's job to do all the work. So if you have some of those may be harder to shift. However, we should still provide the knowledge about the importance of families' engagement and support of their child's learning, and then maybe provide sort of some tools that can be used. But again, we need to know that a lot of times our evidence suggests that you can't really change parents' attitudes about how to raise children, whether it's breastfeeding or any kinds of things. But maybe we could just provide information, but also support practices that we know are helpful. We know that, when parents and adults are talking to children in terms of serve and return, that's important. We know just being warm and sensitive, right? Being responsive, we know that's important. Reducing, having routines are important. Book reading, or even, this is the one that I often kind of push back a little bit on. I'm not saying not to book read. I am saying that we should also recognize that in other cultures, storytelling is just as important and valuable. And then when we sort of force the book reading, it's almost like, you can book read if you're, but you can also tell stories, because that actually activates the imagination, the mind. It creates even more discourse between parents and children. Children get to learn about their heritage, their community, what their families do during the daytime. So the shared book reading and talking to children, or either or, are just as important. Practices that promote children's health and safety, whether it's prenatal care, nutrition and physical activity, and of course, use of less harsh discipline. Again, we can talk all day about discipline, but for us, the evidence just says that less harsh discipline, oral, enriching literacy in the home, routines, warmth and sensitivity, and just contingent conversations in whatever language or home language or a language system, that these are things that really matters. And we should just support families to do it in however they see fit and in however they do it, but not to prescribe, like, you have to read every single second, or you have to just talk in this way. But it's really just saying that these are the things that we know matters for children's development, for their social, emotional well-being, and and so on and so forth. But I will flag that there are things that we don't really know a lot about. We don't know a lot about parents with special needs. We have not done a lot in terms of engaging fathers. There is a growing movement with our fatherhood centers but we do know that we have not done a lot in terms of making sure that fathers are fully engaged, especially fathers of color, especially fathers who may speak a different language than English. A lot of our programming is probably more female centric. And so how do we think about even our workforce is female centric, at least on many of the those who are providing services. And when we do see a male, we either make them the bus driver, the director, the superintendent, or some other level. We actually move them away from the classroom. And is that a good thing? So again, thinking about how to engage fathers and other male figures, but also thinking about the diversity of families, right? We now are seeing, in our census data, we're seeing a much more bigger diversity of families, from whether it's same-sex couple, whether it's mixed status couple, meaning that there may be a family who is undocumented, a family member who is a citizen. So trying to think about the diversity of families that may exist, parents who may have mental illness or substance abuse. So we need to recognize that we don't know a lot. So if you're those working with families and or programs where you have a lot of the males, or you have a lot of families with children with special needs, or even parents themselves who have special needs, we need that information to see how do we make sure that we support the diversity of families, because at the end of it, we don't want to engage with them in a biased way, because it just impacts their level of engagement with us. It impacts really how they may experience the classroom in the program. And then children may be, adversely affected because of how their parents may actually interact with the school and the program. So again, how do we continue to sort of fill in the gaps in these areas around families with special populations, as we call them? Any questions or comments, just feel free to flag as well. I'm almost done with some of my slides, but I want to get to the 4 E's. But I do want to just get to this. I just want to sort of put a bullet in terms of, and this is from a pre-K 3, but I'm going to just focus a little bit. And I just want to focus on sort of why the issue of race, ethnicity matters for family engagement. Because I think we just assume that, families are going to be engaged. We're going to receive that family engagement well. We're going to connect with families. We're going to build relationships. But we don't think that that's not what actually happens. And we have consistent data that continues to show there's racial gaps in the ways that families connect with their teachers, connect with their schools. And this starts in pre-K all the way to 3rd grade and beyond that. And so in this study, I want to just point out just quickly that, and this is not in the slide, I want to show this particular slide. So we asked families, how much are they engaged in the home, whether it's book reading, talking, whatever, like engaged in home-based involvement. And then we ask them, how are you communicating with your school, your child's program, et cetera? And so the light blue is the whole sample. The dark blue is your Black families. The reddish color is your Latina families. The purple is your white families. And so this was a study in the Midwest. And so what you can see is that Black families are like, it's a report at a higher level that they're more likely to be home involved, like involved in the home-based learning and those sort of things, followed by our Latina families, and then compared to our white families. And I should say that the average really is 50. So this is like a T-score. So the average is about 50. So here we see that Black families are above average a little bit. Our about average by about half the same deviation, but our Latina families are a little bit above average, and our white families actually report not engaged in it. It's fine. It's not like it's low, but it's below the 50 average. Now, when it comes to homeschool conferencing, from parents' perspective, the parents are like, yes, I talk a lot with my teachers. So there's the Black families here. The same thing with our Latino families. They say, yes, we also talk with our teachers in our schools. And the white families say, no, not really. We don't, not as much as Black families, not as much as Latino families. So this is all from the parents' perspective. Now, when we ask the question of, to what extent do you have, shared expectations? Do you have, like, for example, do they have similar expectations of the child? To what extent do they trust each other and connect with each other? So this is the parent-teacher relationship scale about joining. And so again, the blue is Black families, the red is our Latina families, the white is the purple is our white families. And from parents' perspective, Black families are less likely to report having sort of this join-in or really this trustful, dependable relationship with teachers. Latina families are a little bit higher, and then white families is higher than everybody else, right? So this is from the parents' perspective. Similarly, they kind of see a similar pattern where teachers of Black children are like, we don't really have a relationship or connection or expectations with our Black families. So much higher for our Latina and also for our white families. And so what the data is telling you is that, Black families are saying, we're engaged, we're doing stuff at home. We are communicating with our school. Again, it could be for good or bad reasons. I don't know. We didn't get that detail. But when they reported, they recognized that our relationship is not as strong, but it's not as bad. But compared to, say, white families and even Latina families, Black families are saying that we don't have a good relationship with our teachers. And teachers are like, yeah, we really don't have a good relationship with our Black parents compared to our white and Latina families. So this is something important to recognize that, again, this is the pattern we've seen with other data. And what we've also come to see is that when we see this kind of data, what we find is that you're likely to have racial differences in terms of how teachers gauge children's behavior. You're likely to see actually not better outcomes in terms of even academics. Some of our academic scores the gap didn't close as much, right? And so this is something that for me is important for us to begin to sort of go deeper and asking, right? When you're talking with families, is find out whether or not, how much do you feel like you have a good relationship? And what are the potential reasons, right? And so we can explore what are the reasons and maybe look at even at your own portfolio of whether it's families who you may engage with or maybe ask those that you may be coaching, who are you likely to have a good relationship with, right? Is it because they look like you? Is it because they sound like you? Maybe come from the same community, maybe have the same educational or life experiences. So again, this is one of those where, and in this study, the majority of the teachers were white. There were some Black teachers, and we haven't looked at the teacher match if that matters. But this is something we've seen in many, many data, and specifically with Black families, right? Even with Latina families who actually may speak a different language, we don't see the fact that language is a barrier, because even for our sample, a good chunk of the Latina families were actually monolingual Spanish, and with some of them being bilingual Spanish and English speakers. But the fact is that language is not determining that, right? But because Black parents for the most part were English speakers. And so the fact is that we do see this pattern of where Black parents and teachers just don't seem to have as strong a relationship as other groups. And so to figure out why that may be the case, and also look for, is that the case for you all as well? And if it's not, maybe, ask your colleagues and begin to figure out what can we do better to make sure that we do develop these sort of affinity with Black families in particular, but even other families of color who may not feel that they have a strong relationship with you or with the program. So this may be the question of, how do you ask families how they're feeling? Do they feel like they can depend on you? Do they feel like you have similar expectations, similar goals for their child? So to what extent do you really connect on the core values about what is important for children's development, on what kind of experience they want their child to have? So being able to figure out how much do you connect? Because if there is a disconnection, how do you fix that, right? So those are kind of things to think through. So now I want to turn to the 4 E's, because to me, right, now that I've kind of, given you sort of a level of like, we need to go a little bit deeper than just, how are you doing? Do you need any kind of referral? Like, yes, you should do those things, right? How can I support your relationship with your child? How can I make you feel connected to the school? Yes, do all that you're doing, but I'm hoping that what I'm sort of pulling for you to do and pushing for you to do is that we have to go beyond sort of the basics, right? We have to see that we are in a system of hierarchy in many ways, and that not all our families are having privileged experiences, right? And not all our families even have the language around racism. To be blunt, many people are like, they don't know what racism is. They're like, I'm just trying to feed my kids. I'm just trying to get to my job. Like, I'm just trying to live day to day. I'm not going to worry about a system, because to them, the system is so invisible. They just know something is not right. Something is not fair. They may have a concern that their child may be treated unfairly. They may have different concerns, but they don't know how to word it or talk about it, because they just want their child to be loved and be in a good environment, right? And they don't want to rock the boat by suggesting things that may feel uncomfortable, right? That's usually what people of color tend to do, is say, you know what, I'm not going to rock the boat. It looks like you're doing an okay job. I'm not going to rock the boat and make you feel uncomfortable. And then your uncomfortability will be passed on to my child, right? So they may just deal with stuff. But the question is, how do you begin to sort of push to the next level? If we're trying to really create a more equitable, accessible system or programming where everybody feels like they're part of it, that they feel like, I see myself, I see my culture, I see my heritage, I see me or those who look like me in this space, that's a different level of connection. That's a different level of partnership and relationship, right? And so the 4 E's is really trying to help schools, programs, professionals really dive in a way that is affirming, that is anti-bias. And so that's what we call, the craft 4E, which stands for culture responsive anti-bias framework of expectation, education, exploration, and empowerment. You'll notice that I no longer really use empowerment, even though a lot of us talk about empowerment with families. After sort of lots of conversations, lots of reading, right? There's sort of this mixed concern about the word empowerment, because what it suggests is that I'm now going to give you power and allow you to be part of this work of the system. And so that's why I kind of now have really sort of moved over a little bit more to equipment, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But the 4 E's really is around this idea of exploration, expectation, education, and now equipment, because this hopefully is the pathway towards having those hard conversations, towards creating spaces that are more affirming of families and of children. And so the first E is really around exploration, right? And this is trying to really, remember when I said way earlier, like hour ago, so plus hour or so ago, where I talked about, like, for me, I hold 2 things in my mind, at least in my head, which is about racialized systems that's both sexist, xenophobic, etc., but also cultural wealth. And part of it is that many times when we sort of get our portfolio of families, we're like, okay, let me look through the names and look through the information of these assessments. And all that gives you information that's good. But what it does is also begins to compartmentalize, right? So basically you begin to create these little nuggets about who this family is. And so because that's how our mind is shaped, by the way. Our mind, because if you read a book, you gotta sort of, like, if somebody says, what did you read about? You gotta at least be able to tell them a quick, like, nugget. The same thing if you are a caseload of 50 or 60, you got to have a nugget. And so when you read the case files or read the files, and and even hear the families, you may begin to create these nuggets in your head even before. And so what I'm asking in exploration is that it's almost like, to some ways, yeah, you can read the files, but it may be really helpful to have the conversation, right? To really go deeper, to say, okay, tell me about your experiences. Like, don't tell me yet about Johnny, right? Just tell me about yourself. Like, how did you get to your career choices? Or what are you doing? What do you find to be your greatest asset? What do you find to be your greatest joy? What are your struggles? What are your fears? Even having conversation about the community you live in. What do you like about it? What don't you like about it? Even asking the questions about anything we should know about your race, your cultural background, your language, anything that we should know, so we can better, support you and your child or children. So again, the exploration is really an opportunity to begin to undo some of the biases, if you have it, right? Because the more you can undo that, the more you can now see this family or this parent and this child in their own light, right? Rather than saying, okay, you're from Peru, you have a whole thing about who's from Peru, what they do, what they don't do, what they can or can't do. By having that conversation, you're able to fill in a lot of gaps, right? That then reduces the biases just by asking questions about, tell me, what do you do? What did you do? If you're from another country, tell me what that was like. Why did you come here? What's so different? Anything that's different, anything that's the same, again, begin to really find out what are the concerns too, right? Because in the end of that part, you want to find out what are the fears, right? For Black families, it could be something. For Latino families, right? For families who might have a child with disability, what are your concerns? That your child may not be included, that they may be left out, the opportunities for them to fully engage in the classroom may be not allowed, or children may make fun of them. So again, it's important that we take this time to really explore. You probably can't fix everything, but by knowing that, it humanizes people. It humanizes the family beyond their sort of social category, like what country, what language, what race, what ethnicity. It really gives you a little bit more to give them their story, right? I think about this TED Talk, and feel free to Google it, is by DJ, called The Danger of a Single Story. And the issue with the danger of single story is that, because a lot of times we see somebody walking down the street and we already have, like, we all do this because that's just human nature. We're like, I know who you are. But do you really? You never talk to them, right? So this is the exploration part, is going deeper with families in ways. And I know you may be busy, so maybe you do it in different chunks, right? Maybe you can also do it in different text or so think about there are different ways to just explore. It doesn't all have to be done at one time, but it can be done in different, when you sort of, pick up the phone, or if you pick up the phone, text in, or even look at their social media page if they have one, right? Because that can give you a sense of what they have been doing or what they may be engaged, thinking about. Because I know people don't understand. So there's a reason why people buy a lot of ads in sort of the social media world, is because that's where a lot of people live. Even our families, right? Even especially families that are international, they live in that space because they can communicate with others, connect with their community, their family, etc. So again, it's important that we use the tools to further discover our families, and again, to reduce the biases that we may make, right? And so think about, as you kind of talk with the families, how the positive program approaches perpetuate inequities, right? Are we privileged in this family? Are we not? Whose voices are we not hearing or being meaningfully sought, right? As you explore with families, as you have conversations, think about, who am I having a long conversation with? Who did I bother calling, right? So again, it's important that we begin to find out, who are we not hearing from, especially for those who may be like, I'm so busy, I just want to focus on the families who actually return my phone calls. But maybe it's the families who did not return your phone calls that need you more, right? So begin to unpack some of that. The second E is around expectations. So, one of the biggest predictor of child outcomes is actually parent expectations and classroom expectations, right? Like, forget everything else. Like, yes, there's a lot of things that matter, but expectations is one of the biggest predictors. Like, if we put like 50 things into a model and that predict children's language, predict their attendance, the biggest thing that's a predictor is expectations. And the reason why we think it is because when you have a particular level of expectations, you create the condition. So if you have a high expectation that this kid here is going to be a brilliant rocket scientist, whatever, right? You're going to create a condition that says, I expect so much of you that I'm going to create the environment where you're going to be enriched, you're going to be thriving. I'm going to expect for you to be able to do X, Y, and Z, of course, within reason, right? Because your expectations are so high for this kid, because you understand, I know you can do more than you think you can do. Similarly, if you have low expectations, then the kid is going to meet you at that low expectations, right? That is the danger of it all, right? So the same thing with families. If we're like, oh, you're poor, oh, you work 3 jobs, oh, you are less than a high school, graduate. So, don't worry about anything. Just bring your kid to school and we'll do wraparound care, do all that. You just go do whatever you're doing. Then yeah, that you're going to get what you get, right? But if I have high expectations, right, that means that we're like, look, we don't have to create meetings that doesn't work for you. What we can say is that, in the end of it, that you are your child's first teacher. And our job here is really to help support you. And so we need to make sure that the kind of environments that we're creating is not to sort of do that self-fulfilling prophecy, like, oh, we know those people don't ever come visit, we know they don't really care, but it's to create the conditions so families can engage in the way that makes sense, right? So that means that we have to have high expectations, even for the family. Like, my mom worked 3 jobs, but yeah, you would think she wasn't involved, but she was, because the conditions she created in the home was like, yeah, I'm going to expect a lot of you guys, right? I may not be home every day, but I expect for you to read, to engage, to be kind, all those things. She didn't have to be there for that, but she created the environment for that to happen. Similarly, we have to create the environment for that to happen. We have to be proactive and expect the most and best from families, but we don't have to use our white normative or middle class lens, right? There are ways that we can do that, right? So we have to examine, what do we expect from families? And whose lens are we using, right? And are we creating obstacles? Like, let me go ahead and create a whole portal that says you must have email to go do this and this and this, right? But some families may not have emails. Or we're going on a field trip and, families, you need to contribute $10. Is that something that is doable for all families, right? So again, it's thinking through, what are our expectations of families? And to what extent is it meaningful and not driven through sort of a white normative or through a middle class or privileged lens, right? So we have to think about the expectations, but we should still have high expectations, because in the end of it, if we believe the adage that parents are children's first teachers, then we have to live it in the way we expect that you are the teacher. And we are part of children's sort of learning, but you are the teacher. You are the teacher forever, right? And so I think the more we understand that, the more that we know that our job is not to go, quote unquote, fix children and families, but it's to provide as much tools and support, and where possible, we can mitigate some things. But our job is really to support families, and to obviously where we are, if we're working directly with children, we also make sure that children are well taken care of, that they're also enriched and all those sort of things. But we really need to make sure that the condition is possible, where families know, as a child's first teacher, you should know these things. Whether or not you can easily activate it, all the details, no, but you can learn over time, right? Because we expect you to be your child's first teacher. And then the other is about education. And this is really to the expectation of just that last part about, we need to be able to provide information, right? It's not about like, we need to make sure families go get formal education. If they want to, that's fine. But this education is really about elevating families' knowledge about policies and systems that may hamper their own or their child development. To me, if you are not providing information of all kinds, right? Like the school system that you have to go to, how to get access to resources, or even about child development, even about the impact of racism on their own development, the impact of racism on their child's development, the potential biases that children might be experiencing. If we're not informing families about that, again, even if they don't care, but knowing that will help make sure that families understand that, you may have to work a little bit harder. Again, not your fault. There may be some obstacles on your way, not your fault. But the more we recognize it, the more we can kind of work collectively. They can say, okay, I know that probably I can't get this house because we have data about your name. If your name is a particular way, or you came from a particular area, or, that you may not get this housing loan. We know those things, right? So informing families about that. Or knowing that, for children, if they need early intervention, let them know that, there's some things that you may want to ask your pediatrician. And as early education professionals, we can find out whether their child can be screened if parents have concerns. Or even if you see something, let them know that it's your right to get screened, your child to be screened, right? So again, it's about educating families about the different systems, and when you can, provide the warm handoff. Again, if you know that for those, I think some people working with refugees, right? There, in some ways, we make it a little bit easier because we provide a lot of stuff in ways it's almost in a package. But if you're sort of an immigrant who comes on your own, or you've been a family who's living in poverty and sort of just dealing with all the different stressors, you may need a different kind of level of toolkit or information. So again, we have to continue to make sure that we are providing information, we're providing sort of networks, right? Because a lot of times, it's about who you know. It's not about how smart you are. I can say, even for myself, being that you come back to UNC, well, I mean, yes, I'm smart. Of course, they should hire me. But it's also about who I know. My networks help, right? And so the more that for some families, their network, building their social capital, people they can call on. Early care education, your program is a network in of itself, right? You have access to information. You have access to health information. You have access to schools and other organizations, right? And so it's important that we provide as much of this for families, especially for families who may not have such privilege or advantages, right? Right. And there's some things you may have to tell them. Now, when you go over here, you may have to make sure you see so and so, right? So being able to give them some of the rules of the game, because in the end of it, if we recognize that we all operate in a system that privileges some and disadvantages many, we need to give people a lot of rules, whether it's about how to buy a home, stock investment, financial literacy, health promotion, dealing with criminal justice issues. Like, again, I'm not asking you to be everything, but what I am saying is that wherever you can help to steer families so that they can be their best selves and be able to activate what they need, right? Because in the end of it, they may never need it, but you never know. You just need to provide the information so that they can activate it and or share with their network, right? Because the more you can penetrate networks, the more the information is used, right? There's a reason why, like, for example, Black Lives Matter took off, because it wasn't just a matter of a couple of people. It was a lot of different people talking, sharing in different spaces and circles, right? And of course, it was a moment in time that was even further activated. So the more that we can build knowledge and share information, expand networks and capital, the more that families don't have to depend only on their small family, community, even childcare systems or programs, right? The more we can expand that network, the more the communities that are often marginalized can get more power, more resources than they ever have, right? So to me, education is not just about the individual parents, it's also about their networks that they are part of, right? Because if I know something about how to get a home, I'm going to share with at least 150 people. And hopefully those 150 people will share with other 150 people, right? Because that is how change happens, right? It could be that one change that makes a parent run for office, right? Like those are how things happen, right? So the more we educate and elevate the knowledge, the more that we know could happen. And then finally, did I miss equipment? Finally, the equipment part. This is that empowerment. Like when we think about empowerment, we're like, we want to make sure that you have all that you need to activate your voice, your power, your brilliance, to be your child's first teacher, right? But to me, in the end of it, families have, we clearly have seen families, some families have power, but not everybody has power, right? The idea, like, think about what's happening where you have people banning books and, going to school board. Primarily that's because of white mothers or white parents and white families. That power is situated there. But families of color, families with children who, have different gender identity, families who are dealing with different kinds of family formation, families who don't speak English, families who are immigrants, right? You're not part of the power system. And so what we need to do is begin to reorient that so there's not privilege in only one voice. Because right now, even in our larger, K-12 world and politics, right, we're privileged in really one voice. When I'm like, for many, many decades, other families of color, like Kofi, I think, founded in Chicago, talked about the importance of listening to voices of families who are often not heard, from Black families to Latino families to Native families to Asian families to families, single parent families, families living in poverty and on the edges, right? And so if we don't listen to all those other families, only listen to one category, that means that families, no matter what you do, you'll always be at the bottom. And so part of what we have to do is help families navigate and challenge the systems that they're part of, whether on a local school space, in a local community, wherever. And so we have to have them understand, to see the system as it is, right? The racialized system, who it privileges, who it doesn't privilege, and help them think about how can you help to activate a system that can hear you? How do you maybe activate your network to speak out? How do you now use social media and all that it commands, right? So in many ways, it's trying to equip families to navigate, to challenge, and to understand the system. Like even early education is not even a system, right? If you're on pre-K versus home-based versus center-based, they're different, or even Head Start, they're very different. However, we can begin to activate those different networks in ways that says, if you're a parent of a young child, we know that there's a lot that you're having to manage, from a pandemic to sort of trying to find affordable care that's close by, that's high quality, all those things. So being able to make sure that we equip families so that they can create the system that they think matters, especially for families of color, families who have been marginalized, families of low income, low wealth needs. So again, this is really the 4 E's, right? So how do we create systems that are fair, that are just, that also really work for those that it should really be intended for, right? For those who really don't have any advantages, for those who don't really have privileges. This is what I would say is sort of how I think about sort of what you can do, right? So that means for you tomorrow or even today, right? Think about the kind of questions you can ask families, right? Particularly families you may not have heard from. Ask them about their dreams and fears. Think about the kind of expectations you have from families, right? If they don't meet it, is it because something's wrong with them, or is it your expectations, right? And is your expectations high level, high impact? Are they really meaningful? Or is it just your way to gauge who you're going to focus on and who you're going to throw in the trash, right? So again, think about who are you siphoning out? Who are you letting in? And what are the reasons? And look internally as to ask yourself, well, am I connected with these families and giving them all this information because I like them, to look like me, that sound like me, right? Or am I discarding others? So again, think about what kind of expectations you have. And then think about how you elevating families' knowledge about many things, right? Again, it could be in different formats, different ways. Again, find out how they like to get information. Find out who they're listening to. With social media and sort of both is pros and cons. We know that it's going to continue to play a role in our children's lives and our families' lives. So think about how to educate families and let them be inquisitive sort of thinkers. And then finally, how do we equip them in ways that says that, you know what, many times you're fighting not just for your child, but you're fighting for your community. You're advocating for your community, right? Even if you write that letter, even if you, go to that meeting here. So I think it's continue to equip families to create systems and programs that really meet their needs, especially for families of color, families with children with disabilities, families who may not speak English as a first language, families who are immigrants, right? So those who are often, families who are low income, the more we can sort of make sure that we're creating systems to give to those, at least that don't have access or don't even have privilege, the more we create those kind of systems and equip those families to really call for what they want and activate them and support them and stand by them, then we're going to create a much stronger system. So to me, so there's different things that you can do at any point in time to really engage in what I call anti-bias, anti-racist classroom programming. And so the final thing I will say is that to get to the 4 E's is that we have to really, really see families as equal partners. Because oftentimes we're like, I'll tell you what to do, parents, and then you just do it. But we have to see the equal partnership in that. And we have to tailor interventions. Again, I don't mean like these big old interventions, but tailor the handoff, right? To meet their needs, right? If you know that there's something that may be a barrier for families connected to the referral, then, make it, tailor it a little bit. Where you can't integrate services. We know there's this, families don't have time. As much as people in the policy world often think, oh, families are sitting at home costing $300 because $300 is going to pay your rent, which we know it doesn't, right? We need to make sure that services are integrated, that they're collaborative, that they're also humanizing. And so how do we integrate services to support families who have, multiple needs, whether it's on the economic level, whether it's because of disability, or whether it's different psychosocial stressors or adversities, right? So we need to begin to think through integrating services. And we know in some places they have a full service effort happening, like in our community action agencies. So how do you continue to, you may not be able to do that right away, but are there different ways you can make it easier, even if it's virtually as well? Create opportunities for parents to receive support from peers. Like, to me, it's not just for you all, the professionals, AKA to do the work, but it's about creating the conditions so that parents can connect with each other, right? Because it also reduces the stigma. When you feel like, am I the only one who's struggling with my son or my daughter reading? Is it me? Or if you, because many times parents blame themselves. If something goes wrong with their kid, the number one thing they're going to do is literally blame themselves. Right. One of my friends, was told, oh, your son reads on a 4th grade level and he's supposed to be reading on the 8th grade level. And the first thing she was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I've been a terrible parent, because you literally take that on. It's like, it is my fault. And it's like, no, your son actually has a disability. Your son has ADHD. And there are things that we need to make sure is in place, right? So that your child, and we discovered that actually the child was doing better because the testing was not done appropriately, right? So again, it's almost like you don't want to shame and blame families, and how do we make sure we reduce stigma? And that can only be done when you're having conversations, connecting families with each other, creating a sense of connection to other parents and communities who may be experiencing something similar, right? So I think that's important. And then of course, there's trauma all over the place, right? From families living in poverty, but even those who are experiencing, whether it's depression or feel the depression or substance abuse, or even those who are living, who have families that are incarcerated or have been killed from either whether it's violence or whether it's from COVID, right? There's a lot of trauma in the air that we have to continue to remember. And we know that can impact parenting. It can impact, children's development. It can even impact you, right? Because when you're dealing with trauma, sometimes you're not always cognizant of it, but it's under the skin, as we talk about, right? So being cognizant of the trauma that you yourself may be experiencing or have, and also your families, what they may be experiencing. Making programs culturally relevant. Again, this is a hard one, right? Because culture is like think about like a Black family. I mean, you could be Black from Africa, Black from the Caribbean, Black from descendant of enslaved people, Black from Latin America. So it's diverse. And so when I say culturally relevant, in the end of it, you can only discover that by connecting with families, by asking their opinions. If there's something I could do to make, my classroom, my program connect to your family, are there things that you're seeing that, we can improve upon? So again, it's thinking about how can you make sure, at least as much as possible, that it's culturally relevant. It could be the workforce. It could be the curriculum. It could be the materials. Again, think about your community and think about, do we have the right workforce in place? Do we have the right supports in place? Do we have the right, materials and assessments in place? So again, it's asking those questions And then, of course, I can't say speaking about fathers, we tend to forget fathers, and they're underrepresented in research, but also in the classroom and in the program. So how do we make sure to elevate, males in the program? Because we probably have boys, right? And it's not just for the boys, but because girls also benefit from males and fathers as well in a different way, as we know from our literature. So again, how do we make sure we also involve fathers and others who don't have sort of the typical heterosexual cis male kind of thing, right? How do we make sure we're really thinking about the involvement of the diversity of people in programming? And then, of course, I want to leave you all with, I want to actually go back to I just want to look for you to see some of these when I did the same word cloud before, like a while ago. These are some of the things that came out around sort of like, how do you create sort of anti-bias family programming and systems, and relationships came out: respect, partnership, collaborative, empowerment, respect for values. So you can see honor. You can see, I'm going to go back to, if I don't want to get you dizzy. I'm going to actually go back to I'm going to go back to the word cloud, because to me, it just shows sort of how we know what we want to do. All right, let me escape that and share my screen now. Okay. I'm going to share my screen so you can see what I was talking about here. Where are you? There you go. You're going to pop up. So you can see, right? Thank you. So people are still filling in. So you can see some of the things that come out. So you can see that connection again about as building trust, it's about equity, about partnerships, about collaboration, connection, partnership. And so the thing is that we literally know what we must do to engage in family engagement and go deeper with anti-bias and really understanding how the systems of privilege and disadvantage work. And the more we can lean into that, recognize that we all don't have the same privileges. Like here I am, a Black woman, but I got a PhD. I have food in the fridge. My house is good, right? Like there's certain privileges that I know I have that others don't have. And so how to recognize the privilege that each of us have and how to activate that. And so I'm hoping that, just through some of the words here, recognize that family engagement is work. But it's also about really building that deep trust, because when you can build that trust, you can have those hard conversations about racism and biases. But I should also point out that having those conversations can build trust, right? So sometimes sometimes like I can't trust you, but when you ask me questions about how am I feeling, I see that on your social media you like this thing. How are you feeling, right? How's your son or your daughter feeling about themselves? Are there anything that you've heard them talk about that may have made you think about their race or their ethnicity, or the things I can do to support your cultural identity or heritage or language, right? So again, when we go through those conversations, it builds more trust, more authentic relationships, more partnerships. And so to me, I say, and I'll share this slide, and obviously the whole slide, but this one, so that we remember then the end of it, we're not going to be perfect. We're not a perfect union, right? But we can get there. And to me, as much as early child writ large kind of puts family engagement and those who work with families on the sort of second tier, I think that this to me is the most important, because the more we can really connect with, lean in, explore with families, engaging them with high expectations, educate them with all the information that we have and we're trained to have, but also most importantly, equip them with the information, the knowledge, the confidence to be the activator, to be the advocate, the more that we know their children will be better for the long run. So with that, I'm going to just remind you of my take home, which is again, that families matter, that homeschool connections really reduce inequitable learning opportunities, that we need to think about authentic partnerships in ways that are deep, that could really begin to mend some of the bridges that are currently here, our partisan politics and the way that we function in this sort of hyper society that we're in. But that we know that the more we can engage with families in an authentic way, the more we can kind of reduce some of that sort of partisanship happening. That partner with families is one strategy to ensure children are thriving and healthy, because we know that when they're in situations where their families feel comfortable, where they feel comfortable, we know many good things could happen. And of course, use the 4 E's of exploration, expectation, education equipment, because the more we can explore who they are or have high expectations, provide knowledge and information and equip them to be advocates for their child, for their community, for their network, then we know children are going to be better for that. So with that, I'm going to stop talking and give us some time for Q&A and just say thank you all just for engaging and being here with me.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible presentation and gave us so much to think about. I think I will pause and see if any questions come through the chat. I would encourage any of the attendees to ask a question of Dr. Iruka while we still have her here for about 15 minutes. So any questions?
Or comments or thoughts or reflections. I know people are still thinking, and it's totally okay.
I'll jump in with a comment. I appreciated what you said just a couple of minutes ago when you pointed out that having these conversations, even though they can be uncomfortable, can be what builds the trust. So we don't need to assume that trust is never going to happen. And if we can have the commitment and the courage to go ahead and move through the discomfort, that in itself can be a very strong trust builder. So I really loved hearing you say that.
Thank you. And even for the program, like for you all's program thinking, right? Because I know when in one of these, I'm part of this larger early child network. And when I said we should ask parents what they feel about this discrimination, racism, they're like, oh my God, no. And then we talked with families, they were like, there was actually mixed, right? It was like, no, because we don't want our pain and trauma on display because we don't think they're going to do anything about it. And the other was, no, I'm uncomfortable. And the other really was at last, right? Because we talk about this when we drop kids off, at least when people are dropping off, but they were like, we talk about this stuff. And it's about time that we don't talk about the things that really are harmful for our kids and ourselves in the shadows, right? So this is almost like the shame of it all. And so I think when school started doing that, it made families feel like, okay, they see us, right? And I think that's something, it's one of those things where you're like, you pick a program, it's high quality, great, okay, good. But there's something when you feel like they see you, they see that you don't have to talk about the things that affect your community, but they see it, right? And there's some discussion about it. It gives you a different level of partnership, relationship, trust, because they now are like talking about things that you were talking about with only your friends and your family members who you trusted. And I think it's important to recognize that in some ways the program, the schools can create the condition, right? It may be hard for teachers to do it. It may be hard even for the family engagement specialists to do it. But if the school is taking it on with their community partners, then it's possible, right? And so it's like, okay, you really do care about this. And now you may see a little bit of like parents emoting a little bit more, right? Like just that mere fact that you see us and you see the pain is really, really huge, right? Like you don't have to do something about it. It's almost like somebody says when you're arguing with your spouse, like you don't have to go fix my problem, just listen to me. And that's really the whole idea, is just listen to me, hear me, see me. And I know you can't solve it, but just by that alone, it's pretty huge, right? It's pretty huge for a lot of communities of color who have often not been seen and heard, and their thoughts and experiences seen and heard.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up comment on that, which is that I think this idea of like leading into conversations about racism, like whether you're a teacher or a provider, there's like a group of folks who are avoidant of it because of their own discomfort. And then I think there's a group who struggle with it because they have done some work and they are trying to be thoughtful about how they engage in conversations around racism because they do not want to re-traumatize or cause harm to people. So I think that there's like this other group that really is prioritizing thinking about anti-bias, but are struggling with approaches of how to navigate those conversations with families because they do care, and they are being thoughtful about not wanting to cause more harm or put more burden on families.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly true, right? Because I'm like, don't talk about it if you can't manage it. But also remember that they're talking with young people, right? Because people assume, some people say, they're too young. Like, why are we even having that conversation? And we know that's literally not. Our evidence is like kids literally begin to see color, like racial, by age of 3. Right? They can actually, they can follow those who look like their caregivers by the age of 9 months. So kids, they are already identifying things based on those kind of things. So I think it's important for adults to understand kids are making judgments. And if we believe that the early years are critically important, so this is my argument with early child community. We talk about the importance of the first 5 years of life, and even more so the first 1,000 days, that it lays the foundation for children's development. And so I'm like, but you know how development works. If you believe that, that means that a lot of what children, the foundation of children's sort of knowledge, their sense of self, their self-identity, a lot of that's probably going to be foundational in the early years. So by trying to ignore this part because you think they're too young, is actually antithetical to child development. That means that there's some things already being set, right? That if we don't talk about it early, at least in the child development the appropriate way, that we're missing out a turn. The second is that you don't have to talk about the negative stuff for young kids. You can just talk about, there's a lot of positive things you can talk about. From like, let's look at your skin color. Let's look at your eyes, like your hair. Let's see how different is it? Like those conversations, right? Even being able to talk about sort of like the fairness, kids know fairness, right? They know when the teacher or somebody's not being fair. So they can have conversations about fairness, right? There's many books that make it easy to have these discussions because kids understand when you're not being fair. So to me, kids are brilliant, curious scientists who are trying to explore and discover. And when adults are shying away from that, it makes it really hard for them to figure things out. And if you leave it to a 5-year-old to make up their mind, you're going to get 5-year-old making up their mind decisions. So I think it's important for us to recognize the power of early childhood, not just the things that are comfortable, but also the things that are uncomfortable, right? And our science is clear that a lot of who children are is set early, because you will hear adults talk about when they were young, how, whether how the color of their skin, how they were made to feel about that, or how they weren't invited to something, or how, they were kicked out because of their race or ethnicity or whatever. You will hear a lot of adults talk about those things. And it was when they were really, really young. And so we need to understand that there is a connection between your life course and what happens in your early years.
It looks like we had one comment from Rosie. Do you see that comment?
Yeah. Yes, Rosie. Yes. Thank you, Rosie. I'm seeing it now. Yes. So Rosie, for those who can't see it, Rosie Galvez says, trust is really important to feel that it's not just numbers, but actually care about what's going on. And I mean, Rosie, I feel like that's really important what you just said. Like that is something that we should all remember, right? Like a lot of times we sort of throw out numbers like, 30% of kids are poor, 30% of, I throw out those numbers, but you're right. It is important that we humanize it, that we see it, right? Because if it's like you're one of your family members or one of your kids in your classroom, your school, knowing that they're impacted by that, hopefully will make you say, I need to pay attention. But you're right. The number sometimes makes it impersonal. It makes you not want to, you're like, I don't know these people. I don't know anybody who's poor, but you don't know who's poor because I was poor. You never knew I was poor because we're like, whatever, we're poor, but we're happy. So because poverty is not written on your forehead necessarily, right? So I think your point is exactly right. Like we need to really begin to go deeper beyond the numbers and ask the questions of families. How are you feeling? How are you doing? Thank you, Susan.
We are just about at time. So I wanted to take a minute to just thank you so very much for this very informative presentation. It has been recorded, so we are going to share it with our networks. And this has just been such a deep learning experience about the importance of family engagement, in conjunction with anti-bias work and anti-racism work. And I hope that everyone takes something actionable and important away from today's event. I know that I have. And so I just want to express our deep gratitude to you, Dr. Iheoma Iruka. Thank you so much for today.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you all. Bye-bye.